Hello, you're probably wondering why I've gathered you all here 20 years after the sad events. I'm novelist and critic Kim Newman, and I'm here with,
Writer and editor Stephen Jones.
and we're here to talk about the 1927 Universal Pictures version of John Willard's play The Cat and the Canary.
Actually, the first version.
First version,
Yeah.
and it's got I think a beautiful, simple credits device. There was a sort of silent movie early 30s craze for doing this, revealed credits rather than title cards. Here we have the hand brushing away the dust.
The cobwebs. But
from-
you know what? It's quite cleverly done because that
Yeah.
took a lot of work. I mean,
Yes.
to do that, and it's. I think it's a great example of what a master Paul Lemley was. I mean, even just down to something like this. And if you looking at this restored print, which is stunning, I think I think it's probably the best version you and I have ever seen.
Oh, absolutely.
I think you actually get to see that he was way ahead of his time. We've talked about this before on other commentaries, but I mean, this is his first American film, isn't it, Kim?
Yes, that's right. He'd made Waxworks in Germany, which
Which is pretty much his only other horror.
Yes, well, he'd made a bunch of other smaller films and quite a lot of short subjects. But Waxworks was obviously the thing that got him his ticket to Hollywood. And that's an anthology film. It's kind of in the expressionist mode. It showcases Paul Wegener and Conrad Veidt.
Who are basically the Christian and Lee of
that's
German
right.
expressionists
And so
in
it
cinema.
gives you that sense. It's still, I would say, rather more of a commercial film than an art movie. It's the kind of thing that German audiences liked, these portmanteau movies in the
it's
1930s.
like Tales from the Crypt or
And-
House that Dripped Blood, yeah.
And so this isn't quite a case of him going Hollywood. I think he was already an artistic filmmaker who was interested in people seeing his films, in making commercial films. And this is the bullet point here is the German expressionist
we're
artistry
looking at
applied
now.
to
Yeah. And to give credit where credit's due,
Broadway melodrama.
Carl
Yeah.
Laemmle is responsible
Yes.
for
Oh,
this. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
often Laemmle is thought of as this head of the studio who had no
The
taste.
man who employed all his relatives.
Yeah, but man employed all his and
made
putting
sure-
his name all over the film.
That's right. Oh, yes.
You know,
He's rather modestly, I think, only mentioned 3 times in the credits of this film.
But-
Usually it's
but no
much
producer
more.
credit, right?
No.
On this one. But I mean, I think he knew talent when he saw it. And obviously being European himself, he obviously must have seen Lenny's work and decided to bring him over.
We're starting here with an expressionist surrealistic montage sequence.
Which must have been quite interesting for a
Yeah.
1927
It's-
audience.
And you notice that this is a sort of trend that Hollywood didn't quite give up on it. All through the 30s, you have films, even things, Warner Brothers gangster movies or whatever, start with weird montages. And I suppose it's a visual way of establishing this stuff. We looked at the John Willard's original play, which just opens with "in the library" and some characters, and we looked at the novelization he wrote of the
Which
play.
is pretty rare in itself.
Yeah,
It's or the film, actually, because he novelized the film. So he wrote the original stage play, then they make a movie of it, which he basically gets a credit on, I guess. Because the stage play is 1922, isn't it?
Yes,
A Broadway
that's
stage play. So it took 4 or 5 years for it to come
Apparently,
to the
he
screen.
was reluctant to sell the rights because he felt that if it was made into a movie, then everybody would know the end and
Which
the
is
play.
pretty. If you think of like the Mousetrap, it
Which is
does
still
give
running, yeah.
the
Yeah.
story away.
That's
yeah.
right. Agatha Christie's deal on the Mousetrap was she sold the movie rights when they could make the film when the play closed, and the play never closed. So
Smart move.
somebody got screwed on the.
But obviously, John Willard needed, and then, but for him to come back and novelize the film of his play is kind of unusual in novelizations. And you and I have both read it, and I think it's actually a smashing novelization. I mean, he's like a pulp writer. He can write for a playwright. He writes like a pulpster.
It zips through, doesn't it?
It does zip through, and he gets the action scenes down. He gets the horror scenes down. But it's just, I mean, the opening paragraph is, I've compared it to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It is just a beautifully crafted opening to a novel, and probably I would love to see somebody, really good read the book over this. I think the two together would go really nicely as a double thing, because the book is great, I think.
And we've also been we've talked over the corridor with the curtains, and now we have the empty house. It's we established the house before we established the people
Again,
in
like
it.
Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah.
You
And that's a very influential set of scenes. There's a sequence in James Whale's The Old Dark House, which essentially reproduces. It's probably the same curtains, because that was only 5 years later at Universal. Imagine quite a few of the props that turn up in Old Dark House movies throughout the 1930s were made for this, because it's a Universal. I think they called them jewels, didn't they?
They did. This one wasn't. Yeah, this was a jewel, but this actually was billed on the posters as a long run special, because it's quite long. It's 108 minutes for a
no, it's 88 minutes.
It's 88 minutes. Sorry, 88 minutes. For a silent movie. But look at it. I mean,
the beautiful overhead shot of the camera and of the corridor and the curtains. And
I mean, do we think this is like? I mean, I know there's been sort of old Dark House movies before, but this kind of sets the scene for all the rest.
I think this was the super production. We'd had actually it came weirdly. The play that started the Old Dark House craze, Seven Keys to Baldpate, in 1912.
Yeah, which there's been many versions
of which there have been. By now, we're already on our third or fourth Baldpate by the time this film gets made. By the end of the 20s,
yeah.
But I think it was the Broadway season of 1922 had the Cat and the Canary, but also the Bat, which is based on a Mary Reinhardt Roberts novel, The Circular Staircase.
Yes.
Not to be confused with The Spiral Staircase, which is something else.
And also The Gorilla.
The Gorilla came, and The Monster, which was a Lon Chaney film. All these plays around, even Dracula kind of fits into this run. They were called mystery plays.
Yeah.
But that meant creepy old houses, reading of the will, sliding panels, secret passageways. Somebody dresses up as a bat, a gorilla, or the cat.
Yeah.
Some shock stuff, and a bit of comedy.
And comedy. That's going to be the important part, because that's the thing I think Paul Lenny brings to this film, which you don't find in German expressionism very often, is a comedy running through it.
Yeah.
And I mean, if this was done as a German film, it would have been pretty glum. It would have been a bit like Waxworks, to be honest. But I think what lifts this film, and I think Universal knew this.
And it had been in Roland West's film of the Bat.
Yeah.
And indeed the Lon Chaney vehicle, The Monster. They tend to get listed as comedies or as parodies rather than straight up horror films, although they have.
I think sometimes people who review those films don't quite realise that they're not overplaying for comedic purposes. That was how they were acting in a silent film.
Yeah.
And it's not really understanding, the audience. They had to basically give a bigger performance. And I mean, I don't think you would ever accuse Chaney of overacting.
No.
I mean, in a film, and I don't think there's pretty much anybody in this. In fact, this film has a lot of underacting in it.
But I think by there was a misreading of the idea of expressionist cinema. People felt that meant pulling a lot of expressions, which obviously silent film acting had to do. But actually, although that was an exaggerated double take,
exactly on time.
But quite a lot of the reactions here are a bit subtler. I mean, the creepy housekeeper is actually rather underplayed. This is actually a really nice clue. It's the Elliot Nugent Bob Hope remake. Rather blandly just has him find that the will's been opened and read, but the the moth that has apparently been alive for 20 years is a good twist.
No, it's a really clever twist, I think. Yeah. I mean, Martha Mattox there, who's playing basically the Gail Sondergaard role.
Yeah, Mammy Pleasant or Mrs. Pleasant. She's Mammy Pleasant in the play, in which she's African American, and looking at it, almost all productions, the early productions had her in blackface, had a white actress playing the role, and none of the films go with a sinister looking black actress.
And in fact, Willard explains in the novelization of the movie, he actually has a line in there that says something like, she was named Mammy Pleasant, but she did not live up to her name
Yes,
or something to
this
get round
unpleasant
that.
person. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking more of the fact that
yeah.
it's the mammy thing. It's like
Yeah.
he describes her with the the hook nose and the thin face and the severe haircut. So he obviously realizes that because they changed it in the movie, he had to explain in the novelization why they changed it.
And I think it may also it shows how quickly things become unacceptable. Yeah, we still had quite a run of scared black servants in horror films.
For 20 more years at least.
But somehow, except of course in films made for black audiences, where
Tom and Jerry cartoons.
where
you
get voodoo women or whatever. The idea of the housekeeper being sinister simply because she's black, that's gone, and we now have an interesting old.
I didn't really know much about Martha Mattox.
She played a very similar role in that talkie, The Monster Walks.
Yeah, Monster Walks 1932, and she's in Murder by the Clock as well, the year before.
Yeah,
and that's about her 2 credits. But you'd have thought she'd have gone on to a whole career of what Gail Sondergaard had.
This is it's a super production of 1927, which is, of course, the year the talkies started.
Yeah.
And almost none of the performers in it had careers that survived into the talkie era, even though many of them lived quite a long time. And looking at it, the myth is that, silent movie actors couldn't hack it in the talkie era because they had bad voices or whatever.
High-pitched voices.
Creighton Hale, the leading man, was Irish. I don't know if he had an Irish accent, but it's sort of thought probably that was less a factor than simply just the rush of new personalities that came into Hollywood with the talkies. Basically made people who'd been stars 2 or 3 years earlier seem really old-fashioned. The change between the 1920s and the 1930s, I mean, there's the Wall Street crash and Prohibition coming to an end, all various other social things happening, seemed to be one of those moments in time where, it was a jumping on point, but it was also a stopping point for
the input of
a
lot of British actors and directors from the stage in England going to America in the early 30s, I think made a huge difference as well.
But a lot of these people had stage records as well, but they all somehow instantly became unfashionable. I think one of the things that's nice about this film now is because they aren't a lot of people we're really familiar with. We get these vivid personalities, and quite a lot of them have huge filmographies of mostly lost films. It's like we don't really know the bulk of Laura LaPlante or Forrest Stanley or Creighton Hale's credits because sadly they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, here we've got Gertrude Astor and Flora Finch. I think my favourite actress in this film is Gertrude Astor as Cecily. I think she gives an amazing performance and is incredibly likeable, incredibly funny. I think she gives a much better performance, to be honest with you, than the star of this movie. And she's almost like a Joan Blondell type.
Yeah, I mean, she's Glenda Farrell got that role later, wasn't it?
But she was the first actress to sign a contract with Universal in 1915.
And she'd been a huge star, but she was fading a bit. The thing I found sort of funny is her real name is Gertrude Eister, and she came from like a working class family.
Yeah, she's not part of the Astors,
is she? But she slightly changed her name to Astor, which was a famous wealthy family, and then got a lot of high society and flapper type roles because of that.
I mean, I again, doing some research on her, I thought it was fascinating. She turns up as the dead body at the beginning of the Scarlet Claw, the Sherlock Holmes movie, and it's like that. Her star, as you were just saying, has fallen from being a sort of good supporting actor in the silent era. That by the early 40s, she turns up as a dead body, but she's still working for Universal.
Yeah. Well, we've said this before about Universal, is that they seem to have. Even though the Laemmles left, a whole new studio regimes took over.
Several regimes took over,
But one of the things that Universal, maybe uniquely of the studios, did was look after their silent actors. The people who've been stars, okay, they were basically extras, but they were still working.
Yeah, they turned up as, night watchmen and stagehands and things like that.
And a bunch of actors in this have later credits at Universal as in unbilled bits or basically as extras. That's a Universal were horrible to their leading actors. It's like the way they treated Bela Lugosi was really bad. However, there was somebody somewhere in the the talent office must have had either a sense of charity or a sense that the studio had been built on the efforts of all these people who were huge stars in like 1918. And they
the other
looked
thing,
after them.
is they just lived near the studios, and it was just like, oh, we'll call them up and they'll do a day's work on as a judge or as a janitor or something, and they got the work.
And they all did those gigs. Yeah.
As I say, I mean, with all these guys, as you said, most of them have got credits. Well, there is an interesting link that runs through this whole film about people who died of blood poisoning, which we'll point out later. It's just, I think 3 people in this movie die of blood poisoning, which I'm not sure was it a big thing in the 20s and 30s?
I wonder, is that a euphemism for
Good point.
for bathtub gin?
I have no idea. It just seemed to be an odd coincidence. All right, here we've got our hero, Creighton Hale, playing Paul Jones. As you said, he's an Irish-born actor, and pretty much Harold Lloyd, isn't he? He's
I think
Harold Lloyd.
He's wearing those Harold Lloyd glasses. I think he's playing weedy, but you can see he's a bit tougher. Isn't he? He's physically quite adept, as of course Harold Lloyd was as well. He looked like a wimp, but actually he was an amazing athlete.
And in fact, even in that scene we've just seen, when running down the corridor and sliding through the door, he's got good timing. I mean, again, he was in 7 Footprints to Satan. It's probably the only other big film that genre fans would know him from, which was made in '29. But he's one of those guys who didn't survive into sound very long, because he had a problem with a divorce and child support, so he was not well looked upon, unfortunately. But I found the most amazing thing was he actually turns up uncredited in Sunset Boulevard as himself.
Yes, yeah. If you remember, there's that sequence where you see a bunch of old time. Buster Keaton is in it, and H.P. Warner, and the Waxworks.
And again, whoever was the casting director on that went, okay, that's who's still around from that period.
That it's terrifying to me that when you think about it, Sunset Boulevard is made in 1950. That's 23 years after this.
Oh yeah, we're twice as far away from Sunset Boulevard as that is from this.
But I'll put it like this: when Sunset Boulevard came out, The Cat and the Canary was as old as the Blair Witch Project and The Sixth Sense are
Good point.
Yeah. And yet and
all these people already forgotten. Most of these people have forgotten.
Right. It's partly the rate, but say the actors of the 1990s are still mostly remembered. Mostly.
I would say. I'm not sure about the 80s though now. That's the other difference. And then here we've got our real heroine, which is Laura LaPlante. As Annabelle West. And again, another victim of the talkies. I mean, her career didn't really... she was in films till about late 50s, I think.
Yeah, and she lived a long time. And she was a huge name at Universal. She was Universal's biggest star. This is a Laura LaPlante film.
Yes, I mean, she and all the posters are her.
She doesn't have a lasting cult reputation the way that, I don't know, Theda Bara or Clara Bow or Joan Crawford or many other...
and they all look the same, didn't they, at that point?
Yeah,
roughly.
She has... I think she looks a little like Drew Barrymore. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah.
She's got a very 1920s flapper hairstyle that would be out of fashion probably by the time this film was reissued with a synchronized soundtrack, or indeed it probably wasn't reissued with a synchronized soundtrack because they remade it as a talkie, which is lost, The Cat Creeps.
Yes, The Cat Creeps, but only a few years later as well, to make it as a talkie, which is interesting. But we've now watched her in this and The Last Warning, which we did a commentary on. She's a bit of a dull heroine, isn't she? I mean, she's very striking on screen. The camera loves her, and she looks great. And her eyes are very expressive. But basically, in both of those Paul Lenny films, it's everything around her that drives the story. She doesn't drive the story in either of those.
I wonder if that's John Willard's fault. Yeah, it's so much the story of the heroine being menaced by a whole bunch of people. She doesn't actually have that much agency. I suppose she finds some jewels on her own. So she does that. And actually, in The Last Warning and this, you're right, there's a secondary woman.
Yes.
Who's much more vibrant and interesting. But you can see the same formula in Mystery of the Wax Museum, where Fay Wray, an iconic presence, has a terrible role, and Glenda Farrell is terrific and steals every scene she's in, and is the actual lead of the film.
But it does seem to be almost like a trope of these kind of films, to be honest.
Yeah.
That,
another one, Mae Clarke in Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Mae Clarke in Waterloo Bridge is astonishing, and you think this woman is huge. In Frankenstein, she's just there.
Yeah.
It seems to be a genre thing that we didn't quite get over.
It's Gertrude Ashley doing all these little touches, and she's doing all that little business, the stage stuff, and you just think, yeah, okay. Whereas you're just sitting there like a plank.
Yeah.
It's just like, I mean, as I say, striking beauty, absolutely striking beauty, and obviously a reasonable actress. I mean, but just not. I mean, obviously she was carrying a lot of films, and Carl Laemmle again pushed her career, made sure that she was at Universal, I think, since she was 15. So I don't know how that works, but so
I mean, the Gish sisters started at like 12, didn't they? Were playing so lead roles. It's a I think there was a sort of feeling that in the very early days the camera was so merciless that it didn't just add 50 pounds, it added 5 years to every and
I think we always say people look much older in those days, don't they? You look at somebody now and they're in middle age and they look ancient. They're in their 70s or 80s now, and I'm sure all these people were not as old as they appear on the screen. But I like all this business. I think, again, this is something that you're starting to see, because before this they just shot the scene.
And it's also, Paul Lenner has got a typical stage scene, a bunch of people sat around a table talking, and he's got to make it exciting for an audience who can't hear the
a word. Exactly.
And so we've got the fiddling with the rings, the lots of
taking the glasses off, putting them back on again,
the looks back and forward. We even had a bit of camera movement in.
I'd say, look at this. I mean, this kind of stuff. I mean, he's literally throwing everything he can at this film. I mean, he's got tracking shots, he's got crane shots, he's got all sorts of stuff going on, which again is something you don't see in a Todd Browning film from the silent era.
Right. And we are and Paul Jones crossing out millionaire. I also think he gave away the ending as well with that shot of handsome, nice guy Charlie Wilder
looking a bit
really
miserable.
brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, I think nowadays we would say that was a clue.
Yeah.
He's dropping some clues to the
Although
audience.
handsome, nice guy Charlie Wilder knows he's not the prime heir because he knows he's the secondary heir. Of course, nobody in the audience is suspecting that good old Charlie could possibly be the killer. In fact, it's only when you come back to this and imagine you've never seen it before, you buy the thing about the escaped maniac. You don't realize there's going to be a reveal at the end.
Yeah.
So it's a whodunit that doesn't let on it's a whodunit until quite late in the day. Therefore, you're not doing what we all, as experienced watchers of mystery movies, I think we probably snagged the killer in vintage Hollywood movies, 95% of the time?
Possibly.
Maybe. I'm trying to think.
But as you say, an audience of 1927, they would be going with the narrative that says there's even when you see the beast, as he's referred to in the novelization, you think, oh, that's the escaped murderer, which is a bit odd because he doesn't even look like a cat to me.
No,
I don't know what he looks like.
He looks like Lon Chaney, basically.
He's got tusks and things and whatever. But that aside, whereas at least the cat in the Bob Hope version looks like a cat, to be honest, which I think that makes sense. But I think for them it would be genuinely surprising when it was revealed, oh no, there's no escaped lunatic. It's somebody you've been watching for the whole movie, for the last 80 minutes or whatever. And it's just like, wow.
The red herring is the Harry, the Arthur Edmund Carew character, which is the role that John Willard wrote for himself.
Yes, he plays it on the stage play, doesn't he? Yes, and it's an interesting role again. I mean, again, you were talking about accents earlier, and Carew was Armenian American. So, and you only have to look at him. He looks like Ricardo Montalban or somebody. So you've probably got a pretty heavy accent you've got to go with.
It's
Although he did make it into sound, and he's one of those guys who did die Oh yes, he committed suicide, didn't
Yes,
he?
that's right. After,
Yeah.
but he'd had health issues.
He had a stroke, I think,
Yeah.
and decided he couldn't live with the stroke and
But
drove
yeah,
back
he
to the beach and killed
became.
himself.
He seemed. I don't know if he got typecast as red herrings because he played a lot, isn't it?
And he's in Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum as a red herring,
Yeah,
isn't he? But he's a
yeah.
good red herring.
Yeah,
And he's a red herring in this, really.
Yeah,
if you
that's
think
right.
about it.
It's true. I kind of wonder if he made a slight tactical error in picking an Anglo name. He could have picked a Hispanic or a Latino name and got in on that Latin lover vogue of the 1920s.
Rudolph Valentino. He looks like a Rudolph Valentino.
Ricardo Cortez.
Yeah.
Very few of those were actually Hispanic.
I think he did actually do some Ricardo Cortez type roles as district attorney and that kind of thing as well.
But
supposedly he was offered the role of Dracula, it's claimed. Which I've never really been aware of.
It makes
Did everybody at university get offered the role of Dracula at some point?
Weirdly, it makes sense to me if you consider that this was The Cat and the Canary was a huge hit.
Yeah.
When they were making Dracula,
a few years later,
it was a Cat and the Canary type film. So yeah, looking to the cast and thinking,
and he doesn't look that different to Lugosi, does he? You imagine his hair slicked back.
He could probably have played it.
Yeah.
Obviously. Lugosi had the inside track,
did he?
They offered it to everybody else. It seemed,
and then they got round to offering it to the guy who played him on stage.
Yeah. Which, fair enough.
Well done, Universal.
This film doesn't star Florence Eldridge and Henry Hull, who created the roles on Broadway.
Yeah, and they were both established actors.
And frankly, Henry Hull and Florence Eldridge were bigger names, or became bigger film names than Creighton Hale and Laura.
Well, Henry Hull was in Werewolf of London only 7 years later or something.
Florence Eldridge married Frederick March and became the co-starred with him in Long Day's Journey to the Night on stage. Less of a film career, but a huge theatre
But
career.
is this not an example of West Coast versus East Coast? That Broadway's over on the East Coast, and they have their stars of stage and whatever. And West Coast, we've got our own stars. We're creating these new stars.
In the 1920s, John Barrymore did both, but not many others did.
But he was a huge star. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody that big anymore. I mean, but Barrymore, the whole Barrymore family, really, wasn't it? I mean,
the royal family of Broadway.
Yeah, the royal family of Broadway and of movies as well, from the silent era onwards. Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. It was almost like I think the new Hollywood, because Hollywood's only a few years old really at this point, were very, very protective of themselves and what they did. It's like, oh no, we don't do that stuff. We do this stuff over here. We're much more commercial or whatever. But I think it's interesting also with this is talking about its influence, and I think it's a big influence on Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, and the whole way it's structured. That each of these characters have their own story, their own arc, which again is unusual in a Hollywood film at this time. Normally they're just there as a cipher or to play their role, whereas this is actually, there's a lot of script writers and adapters and all sorts of people working on this. But what I find amazing is that Paul Lenny could barely speak English at this point. This is his first American film. And so to get that nuance into the performances, and he had help, I know, he had help on the movie as well. The Canadian guy, Robert F. Hill, who's one of the adapters, he apparently worked as sort of like a second assistant director to Lenny. But even so, basically, there's all these little bits of business, there's all this kind of stuff, which is, for a first Hollywood film, I just think is remarkable. The staging of where people stand, how the camera uses them, depth of field. That was a shot on depth of field there, where you could see the people in the background just as well as you could see the people in the foreground. They were in focus. The shot through the chair here, and when she sits down, which I think is stunning on this, when she sits down, she is framed by the back of the chair. This is not just it's thought about, that scene. It's just a beautiful directing scene. They probably have to do it 3 or 4 times so they got it right and hit the marks.
I suspect for Leonard, the attraction of going to America and making films, a lot of other German, Murnau obviously went to America.
Also didn't last long.
Sort of, fake Germans like Erich von Stroheim, and Joseph von Sternberg sort of got.
But Carl Freud and people like that. They're all
But
Well, they
one
were
of the-
getting out of Germany, obviously,
What-
because of the political situation
Yeah,
as well.
But one of the attractions was probably, even by 1927, Hollywood was the watchword for luxury in movie making. I mean, UFA probably were as big a studio in Germany as Universal.
Oh, probably even
in
bigger, yeah, because it was
but-
state-owned.
Simply having the budget to do the sets. I mean, one of the reasons why Expressionism caught on was that it was cheaper to paint flats like Caligari
build them.
than build anything. Whereas here we've gone, and what a gorgeous, almost a subliminal cut there, like in The Exorcist. To the
I think
super
Paul is
musician.
showing off. He's showing.
Oh, yeah.
He's showing universe. Look, I can do this. I can
Yeah.
do this shot. We can do a
Yeah.
crane shot. We can do a
Yeah.
tracking shot. We can put superimposition over here. We've got a
Yeah.
bit of this going on.
We should-
And it's like a calling card to
Yeah.
Hollywood. And of course, the argument is that if he had survived, I mean, he died of blood poisoning through having a tooth infection. You've got to say, sometimes people, go to the dentist. You wouldn't have died, dude.
Yeah.
He was only 44 years old. But one wonders if there'd have been a James Whale or a Todd Browning
absolutely.
and all
I
those
mean,
people. Or he would have just done the Draculas, the Frankensteins, the mummies, and whatever.
He would presumably have been Universal's go-to guy for Dracula.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
thereafter,
would have
who
learned
knows what?
more. I mean,
Yeah.
every time you see one of his films, it's like he's learned another trick,
Yeah.
another thing to do. And certainly by the time The Last Warning, which is only a couple of
Yeah.
years after this,
Yeah.
it's full of that visual trickery and
Yeah.
and superimposition
And he's even
double
starting
exposure.
to play with sound in the synchronized version of that. So
Well, that's what I like about this restored
Yeah.
version. That I think the music score, which is based on the original music score, which I think is great and fits perfectly. But they do put some little sound effects into
Yeah.
this, which is what you might have got in the late 20s, early 30s by then.
I think even if you saw a silent movie in your local picture house where there was one guy with a piano, he'd have a drumstick for the fire.
Or gong or something,
for
whatever.
whenever the guns went off.
Well, saying that, didn't I read somewhere that Paul Lenny actually had a gong or something on the set of this?
Yes,
And so
yeah.
basically, when he wanted his cast to jump, he would bang up, make a loud sound, and
Yeah.
they'd all start,
he's-
which is quite a clever idea. Actually.
It seems to.
George Siegman is the guard there. Yeah.
Now, the thing is, yes, he's overplaying it, but it turns out he's not a real guard. He's an actor pretending to be a guard. I don't know if it's been thought through to that extent, but he is allowed to overdo it. He doesn't overdo it quite as much as Edward Fox in the 1977 version.
Yes, that's true. But I gotta say, I mean, he's an interesting guy. Again, he was a friend of Todd Browning's, which making those connections with the later films of Dracula and whatever, and was involved in a terrible car crash with Browning and another guy. And the other guy died, and those two got away with it. But
it's suggested that Browning sustained injuries in that. I suppose that the dollar book Freud version is the twisted psychology of Browning's later film comes from his
from the crash and
I don't know
injuries and
the
whatever.
films he made before the
were
crash
pretty twisted as well, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, he did lose his front teeth, which I think you can see in this.
Yeah.
You didn't bother putting them back in. But he's in The Man Who Laughs. So Paul Lenny brought him back from The Man Who Laughs a year later. And again, you see a lot of these actors from this film are in the later Paul Lenny movies. And I don't think it's just the Universal made him do that. I think he probably enjoyed working with the Brooklyn Band.
Because it's a faithful adaptation of a play. It's actually quite a small cast compared to, say, The Man Who Laughs, which has got
Which is huge. And,
Yeah,
and as I was saying,
yeah.
basically, I think as Lenny's career went on, the films would have got bigger, they'd have got more complex.
Yeah.
Once you brought sound in,
it's not just Dracula. He might have been up for All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, as I say, James Whale might have not had a career, not been. Although Whale, of course, was involved on stage play again, so maybe that's why they brought him over.
There was and it's also true that some of the German imports, F.W. Murnau's career, although he also died young, he seemed to drift away from the studios when talkies came in, and suddenly being British was probably easier than being German when you're dealing with films shot in the English language.
I think the same is true of Carl Dreyer and people like that. They were very good at what they did, but maybe a little. I mean, as we know, some of the German directors ended up working for Monogram and PRC in the 40s because their careers they'd gone from being big directors down into the sort of like B movies.
Yeah, and then you get Hollywood studios are starting to look at James Whale or later Alfred Hitchcock, foreign directors, but foreign directors who speak English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saves time, we can make the films quicker and cheaper by doing that. I agree. I absolutely agree. Because this must have been a difficult shoot for everybody, but you don't get that sense, and there's no stories about it being a difficult shoot.
No, I suppose because it's entirely studio bound. Oh, and this is one of the
classic scenes of
classic
horror
creepy
cinema.
scenes. Yeah, it is. The Clutching Hand. Although the Clutching Hand was a couple of years earlier as a screen character.
But obviously, the killer's gone to a lot of trouble to make up his hand with fur. And
that's right. Yeah.
It's like, why go to all that trouble?
I think that's one of the reasons why it's a bit more of a twist when we find out it's somebody dressed up.
An escape lunatic called the Cat.
Yeah.
And I think the Bob Hope version, the 1939 version, does that very well. I think the makeup is fantastic. Whereas the 1979 remake, I don't think is as good.
It's a weird look, and nobody's ever identified the actor who plays the cat in that.
Maybe it was a real escape.
Yeah.
Who knows? But except for those and the cat creeps, that's about it, right? For the Cat and Canary.
Well,
which is odd because
there's a
Spanish
TV
version,
and there are two. Well, there are three TV versions. There's a British one with Bob Monkhouse in the lead.
Yeah.
And then there's
a Swedish one, isn't there?
There's a Swedish one, and there was an American one on one of those Dow Hour of Great Mystery. Type things.
Yeah.
But I assume that all of those are just the play done in front of.
Well, they were on
TV
for an hour
cameras.
as well, so they're pretty.
So a trimmed down version of the play done for the cameras. But that's it. Since 1977, the Cat and the Canary has rested. It's been revived in the theatre, but not as often as
the Ghost Train.
The Ghost Train, which is the Ghost Train is the British entry in this cycle of plays. Arnold Ridley, later Private Godfrey on Dad's Army, and is he the uncle of Daisy Ridley, the Jedi? Yeah.
Yes. Well, the grandfather maybe, I would think, rather than the uncle.
But that also is very much in this little run of properties, and I suppose nobody's remade The Bat, or in fact nobody's done.
Well, The Bat was remade 59 with Vincent Price.
Yeah, and 70s to Baldpate was last done as House of the Long Shadows in 1983.
Yeah, with a star cast.
And there are a bunch of others, little plays like The Gorilla. I think has been left alone since the Ritz brothers took a whack at it
and destroyed it.
Yeah. We've said this before on Tracks. Eventually, somebody's going to do one of these again.
I think Kenneth Branagh should go and do the Cat and the Canary, an all-star Cat and the Canary. Yeah. And the same way he's doing those Agatha Christie movies at the moment, where every single person in the cast is a known name and face. The idea of Branagh doing a version of this, I think, would be stunning. Especially after the most recent Agatha Christie he's done, A Murder in Venice, which is basically a horror movie. It's basically this movie around a seance, based around a seance. So there are people who are still doing movies like that.
Yeah, and I suppose what it's proved is this particular formula almost always works. I actually don't think. I think Branagh's rather clumsy, but that film actually plays. Because it's really simple. Put a bunch of suspects in a house, kill some people,
or on a train, or a boat, or a waiting room at a station.
I'll happily watch that on a bank holiday Monday afternoon.
A rainy Sunday. Rainy Sunday.
And that's always been the appeal. I find there's a great comfort in this particular subgenre of. I think a lot of horror fans tend to look a bit askance because when this was made, the horror film as we know it didn't really exist. This is like the prehistory of Hollywood horror as a genre, and yet it's absolutely formative on it. So much subsequent.
Although already the pulp magazines were publishing this kind of fiction. And obviously, as we said, the stage were doing these kind of mysteries. But really, I guess 1930-31 Dracula is when horror became with a capital H. But all of these, they're still finding their ways. Even films like, and we've done commentaries, Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback of Notre Dame, they were considered dramas more than,
one's a big
mysteries,
historical epic
gothics,
or a melodrama. Phantom is almost a musical as well. It's got all these things. It's not until Dracula, when an actual vampire, walks into a drawing room,
pretend to be a vampire.
It's not, and it's why a lot of horror fans find the ending of Mark of the Vampire, remake of London After Midnight, disappointing because he's not a vampire. But that was the default ending. In 1935, there'd only been one film where that hadn't been the end. And so that's kind of what you're expecting. Probably when Dracula came out.
When's Condemned to Live? Is that around about that time?
It's about then. Yeah,
it's about then.
When Dracula came out, there must have been some audiences who were sitting there waiting for the explanation.
He's an actor, but
that are waiting for Edward Van Sloan to say, I know you're just a smuggler pretending to be a vampire.
Which, of course, is the ending of London After Midnight.
Yes, that's right.
As well. And that was only, again, 4 or 5 years before Dracula. So that's exactly what audiences would be expecting. But I think the clever thing about not just the Cat and the Canary, but all these other ones we've talked about, is they had to come up with a different way of revealing the killer. Whether this one goes for for the insanity clause. But sometimes they have a griller in the basement.
Yes, that's right.
Or some other weird thing going on.
It's usually a scheming heir in a gorilla suit.
But exactly wandering around. Which is like, okay, that didn't see that coming. But this is the film I think that sets. I mean, you go back and you take it apart, and it really is. There's nothing new under the sun that's not in this movie. To be honest with you,
I think the thing this really adds to the genre is the reading of the will. Which is the hook that gets everybody into this house. The 20-year delay. The opening and the treasure. It's like, when you get to the Bob Hope version, which is only like 11 years later, Bob Hope comes on and says, I've seen plays like this, and sort of does all this metafictional stuff about, I've been in places, and there'll be hidden treasure, and the heroine will inherit, and then there'll be a murderer, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, that's only 10 years later, you're doing this business.
Well, you're basically pastiching it, which I think that film does. But as you and I have talked about on that commentary for the Cat and the Canary, it becomes a Bob Hope vehicle in the same way that this is technically a Laura LaPlante vehicle. The identity, the characters. I mean, Paulette Goddard's fabulous in that remake anyway.
Oh yeah, she's actually a much livelier character, but she isn't quite given the glamour. I mean,
no,
literally, look at the way she's lit. So she has this penumbra of glow around her whenever she's on screen.
As I said, you look at her eyes and you can see why she was a star. As I say, I'm not so sure about her acting ability or actually her look, because she's not actually very beautiful. She's quite plain of face and features, but she had
great. A look that was very fashionable then.
Yes,
I think
I agree.
It's that weird thing. Sometimes you look at older films and standards of beauty have changed, and then sometimes they don't.
Clara Bow, for example, it looks as vivacious then as she would do now if she was alive.
But also, probably the most iconic screen women of that era would be Louise Brooks and Anna May Wong. Both of whom had to leave Hollywood to get work. Because for various reasons, although they are classically beautiful and perfectly of their time, and frankly, you can find pictures of them all over the internet now, and
you wouldn't know it was a 100-year-old photo.
Yeah, that's right. Try searching for Laura LaPlante images. And yet there was something about them that wasn't particularly congenial to
maybe at the time,
mainstream American movies.
Didn't appeal to that audience at the time.
But appeals to us 100 years later.
This is a crane shot. He put there's a little crane shot in there, which means it must have been made like on wood or something, because cranes were only just being invented, and tracking was just being invented.
And because if this film is entirely indoors, the amount of control that the director has over stuff like that,
and the lighting. I mean, again, the expressionist lighting on this film is just stunning. I mean, actually, I think even James Whale's The Old Dark House, which is very influenced by this,
isn't quite as ambitious with what it does with the camera in its house. And then we're used to so many 1930s films shot very cheaply on sets, probably borrowed from this. Things like The Monster War.
Yes, and Condemned to Live
Secret
and
of the
all those.
Blue Room.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just seeing a film that's of this type, but made with absolutely the full sort of range of cinematic invention, just seems a bit wrong almost. We're used to seeing the cheap versions, the knockoffs, but seeing again, does that give it away?
Well, no, because they do it to each other.
They
So
do,
it's
yeah.
basically, I think,
Yeah.
it's like, well, it could be him
There's-
or it might be him. You're both looking sinister, you know, at this point.
There's a very similar shot in Haunted House of Horror in 1968, isn't there, where you get which one of these guys has got the knife?
Well, it's interesting, you know, the guy playing Charles Wilder, which is Forrest Stanley, who was actually English, born in Birmingham. Basically, his last film was in 1959, Curse of the Undead, AIP. So again, at least he had a career, but again, well, not as a star, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, he's uncredited by the end of his career.
He's another one of those long-lasting but bit parts.
But was reduced to bit parts when sound came in. And I just find this fascinating. I also think what's great, and you mentioned it earlier, Kim, was the fact that Hollywood was seen as the place of wealth and everything. If you look at the clothes all the women wear in this film, they're all wearing incredible furs.
Yes.
And you know, lovely jewellery and whatever.
I suppose it's supposed to be a rich family, isn't it? But
even her dressing gown has got silk in it.
It is the idea of glamour. American movies have glamour. Even when we're set in a decaying old house full of mad people, everybody looks terrific. There is a sort of an aspirational sense to it. I wonder if the fact that the Wall Street crash is about to come and people are about to have a very different attitude to rich people in the next decade.
I think at this point it's aspirational.
Yeah.
And then it becomes something very different after that. But also, I mean, you did mention earlier, this was a Universal Super Jewel, and they were films that and Hunchback of Notre Dame is as well, where they weren't afraid to spend money on a movie. But of course, that set them bankrupt by the 1930s.
Yes, but for the Hunchback of Notre Dame, they had to build a cathedral and get hundreds and hundreds of extras. For All Quiet on the Western Front, they had to fight World War One.
Yes, build World War One.
Right. This is still 8 people in a haunted house,
which means you make the haunted house look really fabulous on the budget.
That's right.
I mean, except for what it looks like a matte painting of the exterior of the house.
But even that is very much in the expressionist style.
Oh, very much so. The painted set.
It's that weird stylized look.
But they still have little lights moving around on it and candles coming in windows and things. It's almost animated.
And it's something that you notice in vintage old dark house movies is that they very rarely have exteriors of the old dark house. If you look at the old dark house, the Whale films, you cannot get a sense of what the house
you get the doorway,
looks like.
Don't you? As they come up out the rain, they knock on the door.
Whereas
and
I suppose
everything.
you get Castle Dracula, and some of the Gothic horror films show you the ruins.
Frankenstein's Tower, Bride of Frankenstein's Tower.
But I think maybe because they were shot on the Universal Backlot, it's not until things like The Haunting where you spend a lot of time looking at the old dark house from the outside and get a sense of its place in a landscape.
I mean, the old dark house is called the old dark house, but it's not really about the house, it's about the people in it,
yes,
isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's from a book called Benighted, which makes much more sense,
Yeah.
but was probably a bit classy for Hollywood. And actually, I think the Old Dark House title predates the film. I think it's the American publication title of the novel.
They changed it from Benighted. Okay.
Yeah.
That would make sense. Yeah.
And here we're building to
well, as you said, there's always the hidden treasure. I mean, I was watching Bulldog Drummond's Secret Treasure the other week, which is basically the same plot, but done as a Bulldog Drummond movie. Just not not so many horror elements. So he does have a crazy killer in it at the end.
Yes.
So again, even into mainstream cinema by then, they were still using these elements.
And here we've got, I suppose it's almost a false scare, isn't it? The face we can't quite make.
Yes,
out.
it's the guard, but we're meant to think it could be the escaped killer. But yeah, again, this is not a dour film in any way. And if you're if you're an audience, you don't want to be depressed or scared all the time. You want humor, and I think this is the moment where we start to see humor come into horror films in a pretty big way. You mentioned The Monster earlier with Lon Chaney. I wouldn't consider it a comedy film, but it does have humorous elements.
And it's one of the few films where you see that Lon Chaney could be funny.
Yes,
which he doesn't. He does occasionally. There's a what we now think of as camp touches in quite a few of his performances. But The Monster is the one where he really sends himself up.
He knows he's doing that. I mean, he's playing himself, basically. Playing himself. And you're starting to get that in all these films now. Almost a sense of, we've seen that before, so what are we going to... We have to make it a little bit different this time. We have to change this around.
Sequence isn't in any other version of the story. It's not in the Bob Hope film, although it's kind of physical comedy that you think they would use. It's not in the play. It's actually a bit saucy, isn't it? The guy hiding under the two
very saucy.
Bed.
Wait, actually, when they start disrobing to go to bed, I mean, it's pre-Hays Code. This, and I don't think they would have got away with it in the 1930s. No. Especially when Gertrude Astor starts taking her stockings off and whatever. It becomes pretty racy.
And the the bed spring in his bum as well. It's
holding him back. But he's just looking at her, and of course, I think it wasn't ankles were meant to be quite sexy in those days, and he's just staring at her silk stockinged ankle. But I mean, there is actually quite an interesting scene in the 1978 version where it's implied that Honor Blackman's character is a lesbian. And
Olivia Hussey is that. But
so they redo this scene
I looked at all the reviews of that, and they all mention that as an addition that Radley Metzger made.
Who was a porn
film.
director. But
a classy porn director. The opening of Mr. Beethoven. I actually worked with him briefly, and he was a really great guy. But they all said that he added that. I don't know. I think that's an implication here. I think it's implied in all versions of Cat and the Canary.
Interesting. Well, they're cousins, aren't they? Supposedly, they're cousins here.
Quite often.
But you do have the two women sleeping in the same bed,
that's
kind
right.
of thing,
In depictions of lesbian couples in classic British and American cinema, they're often presented as sort of tweedy sisters, cousins, aren't they? It's the euphemism is the relationship.
The secretary and the
that's right.
And the whatever.
I think that's an element here, and indeed in the play, and Metzger just maybe underlined it a bit more
for the 70s audience. Yeah, maybe. I mean, and obviously we know that they were much freer about sexuality back in the teens and 20s than they were maybe in the 30s and 40s. There wasn't clamping down.
That Radley did in his version, which he wrote for Richard Gordon, the producer, was that he didn't remake the Bob Hope film. He went back to the play. He added a few extra murders to goose it up, and actually it ends with a kind of torture porn sequence, isn't it? It's got a restraint chair and the influence of Torah, which goes in a completely different direction. How do you feel about Flora Finch?
You know what? She's all right. There's a whole bunch of these women in these spinster type women. Again, talking about the Bulldog Drummond series, there's the aunt in that who runs through every episode. But I think she's okay. She's another British actress who was out there. She's one of those people who died of blood poisoning, like the director.
And she had been in comedy shorts, and she was
very famous as a duo.
Was it John Bunny? Was her?
Is that the name? Bunny or Bunyan or something like that?
Yeah,
and they did loads of them.
And sort of
she was like the Morecambe and Wise of her time.
There were dozens and dozens of Bunny's Birthday, Cutie's Vacation.
They're all like 10-minute
baggage
comedy shorts. But she plays this very well. I think she plays exactly to the type of character she's meant to be.
She sometimes played Old Mother Riley type character, Irish washerwomen type characters. Here she's a bit higher toned than that. But
I was going to point out earlier, there was just an animated intertitle there as well, which is something you're thinking, wow. I mean, they've really pushed the boat out on this to do an animated intertitle, and that's an original one. It's not for the for this. But yeah, I mean, again, she's somebody who, when she died in when was it? When she died, I think she died around about 1940. She was working as a bit player at MGM then. Again, she was just working.
Her last film is The Women, that all women movie, which is I always find this whole thing about finding the clue and saying it's one of those weird bits of business. It's in Suspiria. It's sort of stuck in Dario Argento's mind all those years. But it just goes to show how widely influential within the genre this property is.
I'm going to say Cyrus's note wasn't very clear, so she could have spent weeks wandering in that room, pushing everything around the fireplace.
Yeah, and this became something that was reiterated in many subsequent. I think is it Home Sweet Homicide has a really good mystery rhyme in nonsense.
It does, but I kind of like that, and I think I mean, again, it comes from Conan Doyle, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right.
It's the rhyming couplet or whatever. It's the clue to where the treasure is hidden. And again, I think that's something he created beyond Sherlock Holmes stories. But it's something that I like, that that kind of that clue, that rhyme. Here it's done with the notes, and I think that's perfectly reasonable in this because you've got the solicitor and everything else.
Yeah, and in the Ghostbreakers, it's a literal notes on the organ, isn't it? And I think that's been used several times.
And sometimes it's the carving over the crypt. That's another one that they use it. But basically, as you say, it's the same storytelling trope. It's a way of getting that information out there. I've never actually quite worked out what Mummy Pleasant is doing. I mean, we see her trying to break into the safe at the beginning. Why? And sometimes, if it was revealed, I think we've seen this version as well, where it's revealed she's the heroine's mother.
Yes.
You remember that? That's been done before, and you get a sense that she is trying to protect Annabelle in this movie against the other family.
When Gail Sondergaard plays the role, there's a sort of hint that she was the mistress.
Yes, I got that in this as well, to be honest.
And I think it doesn't seem to be anything. For instance, I mean, John Willard doesn't play that up in the novel. I think partly because the character he wrote on stage. You couldn't have had a mixed race relationship on stage.
Would not have been allowed back then anyway.
Banned.
Yes.
But also, she's not conceived as being a sexy character. Whereas here, the housekeeper, although she has a sort of Miss Havisham look, there is a possibility that she's a love
and in
interest.
the novel, Willard said, she was obviously once a very beautiful woman when in her youth, and you get the sense that she could have had an affair with Cyrus, and the result is Annabelle. And I certainly got that. Yet there was no payoff on it. It's almost implicit. Here's, of course, the other great classic scene, which was on the poster for the movie. In fact,
it is the key moment, isn't it? I think it's almost like, if you want one image to sum up the silent horror film, this is it. It's a clutching hand.
Doesn't Carlos Clarence use it on the front of his book? I think. But this, and it's a beautiful image, and they used it on all the artwork for this movie.
There's
as
a
well.
little bit of Nosferatu there, in the shadow of the fingers.
And look at that, and animated. Title again.
And the sense that there's you know that the musical accompanist will have really pushed all the stops on that. Literally pushed
all the stops on the organ.
To get
the screaming noise. It's great. And again, this film moves. Unlike so many, and I'm not as big a silent film fan as you are, and I've said this before on commentaries. But when you see a Paul Lenny movie like this, it moves. It's not actors walking in front of a camera. It's the camera following the actors, and that's the difference.
And I think that's why Carl Laemmle and other studios were so excited to get these European guys in to direct. It's like, I think probably because the movies in America had begun as a sideshow. And they had got this kind of factory crank 'em out, and it is that image you've got of the fixed camera
lockdown
and people
camera,
fighting
and people walking past it.
And of course, you had D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille and other people doing stuff, but there was a sort of feeling that other film industries didn't have those set of rules and those set of demands, and so they encouraged a kind of invention that I think is still exciting 100 years later. Yeah, and it's still. Yeah,
but I mean,
it's
it
busy
bled into
in
the
a way.
30s. I mean, if you look at Dracula, it's a pretty.
Yeah.
I mean, the American version of Dracula is a pretty static version of Dracula. The Spanish language version plays a lot more with
it
this
moves a
moving
lot
camera.
like
Yeah.
this.
And that's different. It's an American director, it's
Yeah.
George Medford, but you get a sense that he's learning the European method, whereas Todd Browning, whose career was pretty much over by the end of the 30s anyway, is stuck in the silent era. But again, it's something you said earlier, a lot of this stuff that's being developed and filmed at this point are stage plays, and they play like film stage plays. It's only now we're starting to get cinema coming into its own as a technique, as a genre. And I think this film, more than any film, is what changed Hollywood.
One thing I will say, obviously, Paul Lenny coming in as the big factor on this, but Gilbert Warrington, the cinematographer, and
Excellent.
particularly Charles D. Hall, the production designer,
Yes.
on it. They were doing things that would then become the default way of making creepy movies for the next 30, 40 years.
Yeah, the three great eras of Universal horror.
And Gil Warrington, ended up doing Panic in Year Zero and Master of the World for.
There's a few of them that actually do get through into those early.
He
Into
did
that
the
sort
Ghost
early
of
60s.
Dragstrip Hollow. I mean, which it's sort of an astonishing thing.
And they must have been quite old by that point
Yes,
as well, even
yeah.
if they started young in the silent era.
Yeah. Whereas Charles D. Hall, of course, did Frankenstein, also Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, but so much, and he was British.
But he was under contract for Universal, wasn't he, Charles D. Hall? He was their go-to guy.
But stuff like Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein.
Yeah, I've seen
Paul
his
Lenny
sketches.
had it,
His
he did
sketches for Bride of
Murders in the
Frankenstein are
Rue
fabulous.
Morgue, Waterloo Bridge, Dracula, All Quiet on the Western Front, The Last Performance, The Last Warning, The Man Who Laughs. Obviously, Paul Lenny liked.
But again, a bit
But
like
if
Jack
you-
Pierce, he was the guy they just got to do this because he was the guy on. He was the supervisor.
But he could turn around and do something as atypical as The Black Cat, the Edgar G. Ulmer
Again.
kind of Art Deco version.
Yeah, German
But-
expressionism though.
Yeah. And he fit in the Vampire Bat as well. But these films are like the canon of American horror in the 1920s and 30s. And it starts with this.
But people don't talk about, when they talk about these films, and I guess we can blame the French for this in the 50s, the auteur theory. They don't talk about the set design and the cinema, unless it's Carl Freud on Dracula because he didn't want to direct the Mummy. But so all of that's kind of lost in a way.
And I think that's what Hollywood gave these auteur filmmakers, is the backup of the imaginative craftsman.
Well, it was called a film factory for a reason,
Yeah,
wasn't
that's
it?
right. And having a whole bunch of people, and I tell you, that window seat and that mullion window,
That mullion window's in The Invisible Man.
You're gonna be seeing a lot more of that.
There's whole scenes in The Invisible Man of Claude Rains standing in front of it ranting.
If you watch all the Universal horrors of the 1930s, you're going to be seeing all these bits and pieces redressed.
Just rearranged, just redressed around, which I think is brilliant. I mean, I've said before when we've done these commentaries, I was lucky enough back in the 70s to go through the Universal prop warehouse on the studio backlot, and it was still there. I mean, it was all filed away very neatly. It was all numbered so you could find it. All these paintings you see on the walls, a lot of these were still there. I remember going through, and weirdly, I don't know why, I'm sure this is true, I remember seeing the Laura painting, which wasn't even a Universal movie, but obviously they brought up the props from another studio, and it was in there. And they kept this stuff because it was a way of saving money. The grandfather clock, which we saw at the beginning, I'm sure it turns up in the. I think it turns up in The Last Warning, for example. I think it's definitely in The Last Warning. Reusing these sets was a way of saving money, and they were built. They unlike now when you build a set and it's out of balsa wood and foam and whatever. These were built out of real wood, most of these sets. Craftsmen built these things, and then the stairway would be kept as a stairway and then wheeled out on wheels to go into another set. Which is why, of course, in Gone with the Wind, so many of the things in Gone with the Wind are in previous MGM films. and they're just used in a different way. And it was a real sense of craftsmanship. And there's no reason why we have all those windows and all those drapes down there. It's just
it
a
looks
great
good.
look.
And
it gives you depth of field. It gives the camera depth of
field. And actually, that seems to be something that Paul Lanny has decided, particularly for this film, is to have depth of field. It's full of people coming from the rear
background,
of the image
rear to foreground, and foreground to rear. Absolutely.
Rather than side to side, which quite a lot of American cinema, even now, is still basically
two
like
heads
puppet
talking to
theatre.
each other, on the left and right.
So much of this is, it prefigures the deep focus framing of film noir. He doesn't have deep focus because he quite likes people being slightly out of focus.
I'm not sure they even had the lenses for deep focus
and I doubt,
this point. I mean, I doubt the lenses have even been invented at this point for a real deep focus. But he does hold the focus between front and back of the shot, which is a difficult thing to do. There, you see, those drapes are almost in focus at the back there. But that's several feet or several yards away.
And this is getting close to that Scooby-Doo running around the corridors, people poking their heads out of
doors and things. Well, again, a very stage thing, of course. It's like people going through a door one side and then somebody else coming out the door the other side of the corridor. But again, I like the fact that we hear the sound of the wind over the soundtrack here. It gives an added extra to this film, which you don't really notice.
We're getting to the point that the comedy starts seeping out now, and it becomes more of a kind of crescendo of suspense and horror. It's like we lose Paul, our hero, actually gets sort of sidelined for quite a bit of the climax, whereas Bob Hope stays around for it.
That's because it was a Bob Hope vehicle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But again, Paul changes at this point. He's still a buffoon.
Yeah.
But it's almost like his character has grown through the film as well. He wasn't really a hero when he arrived. He was almost a comedy relief.
Yeah.
And yet by this point now he's starting to become. You would think maybe it was it would have been Harry would have been.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, it's interesting that Charlie is not quite around as much during these scenes.
Yeah, I think this plays a bit fairer than the Bob Hope film in terms of the quick changes. There are a couple of scenes where you get the cat, and then suddenly Charlie's there in a dressing gown, like 2 seconds later. Yeah. Whereas here, there's a bit more thought to his possibility of he's busy putting on his quite elaborate, scary makeup. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is again. I think this is more theatre than it is cinema. This stuff. Yeah, you stay here. We're going out and investigate. And whereas Bob Hope does play that exact same scene for laughs. Yeah. Because he's the scaredy cat in that movie. It's really basically Creighton Hale created that role. Yeah. Bob Hope just made it his own. And of course, the missing body, which I always think is another one of these great things.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks, you're mad. There was no body in the first place, but of course everybody saw this one.
And the we got the tumbling of the corpse.
Yeah, the low angle shot is absolutely shot for shot in the Bob Hope version.
Yeah,
whereas it's George Zucco who comes out the closet.
The second act curtain of The Cat and the Canary, and all the reviews mention the theatre version has two big scares, actually. The first act curtain and the second act curtain. One's the monster stands up from behind some furniture at the end of the first act, and then the dead lawyer falls out at the end of the second act.
And those beats aren't really in this, are they?
They're here, but in different spots. The pacing's changed. I think probably some bits of business have been cut, and also maybe there was a feeling that those were theatrical devices that didn't quite play in the movies. There are other ways of being shocking in the movies.
But also the other thing about that, of course, is that eventually movies did go into a 3-act format.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas at this point there isn't a 3-act format in movies. It's just one continuous movie.
Yeah.
But by the 1930s, it is the opening, the middle, and the end. Yeah. And so they really adopted the theatrical precedent, which I think is interesting.
One of the a thing that it does that horror films later is it almost takes place in real time.
Yeah.
It's just one evening. I mean, one of the other films in this genre is called One Exciting Night, and that's kind of the premise, isn't it?
But it's not quite as exciting as this night, though.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
But that's a great shot. Isn't that a fabulous shot? And actually, we do get a lot of exterior stuff going on here. Again, and more animated titles, which must have been incredible.
Yeah. And now we have this guy.
This guy.
Who is another... his name is Joe Murphy. He's uncredited, although
He had a long career.
he had a long career, and he was popular as a character called Andy Gump in a whole bunch of comedy shorts around this time. So it's almost like
He's a guest
his
star.
comedy character is being a cameo guest star.
Yeah, cameo guest star. I thought that.
I suspect audiences would have just instantly recognized, because it's a very distinctive face.
Yeah, very much a character actor, yes.
He is a human cartoon. Yeah.
Or even his ghost animated
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
thing. It's almost like a catchphrase, isn't it, with him?
He actually stuck around, and he didn't die until 1961, although he retired in the late 1930s.
But again, just a nice, interesting little bit of business going on there, and this is quite nice as well. This is like a sort of like, we need one more little bump of horror before we get to the climax.
Yeah, and this character is cut out of the Bob Hope film, which is the shortest version of Cat and the Canary, and it is a key to It's actually, Willard's plot is really tight. And it's all to do with Cyrus West being A, insane, and B, worrying about the insanity in his family. Which is why the whole point is not the heroine being killed, but the heroine being driven mad. And so this guy, the psychiatrist, has to turn up just when everything looks... where anything she can do will make her look mad,
which has been set up,
and now this crazy guy turns up.
Well, I mean, so first of all, do you think that this is an obvious nod to Dr. Caligari?
Absolutely. Yeah,
it's like an in joke for Paul Lenny.
He doesn't look quite as much like Dr. Caligari as Boris Karloff does in The Bells.
But I think he also looks like the toy maker. Is it in March of the Wooden Soldiers?
Yes, Henry Brandon.
Henry Brandon in the Laurel and Hardy movie. It's very similar makeup.
From stills, it looks to me like the psychiatrist in The Cat Creeps is much closer to Caligari than our character here, who is
there's only a few minutes of footage of The Cat Creeps, isn't there?
That's right.
And weirdly, both versions, was the Spanish version and the American version, which is weird for a 1930s movie. But I think there was a trailer or something that survived.
I would suspect it's one of those incidences. Rather like, if you remember, for many years, the Frederick March Jekyll and Hyde was more or less lost because MGM had suppressed it when they made Spencer Tracy. I think probably when Paramount made Cat and the Canary, they probably did their best to bury The Cat Creeps.
And House of Wax did it with Mystery of the Wax Museum.
But they probably didn't bother to bury the silent film because they thought it would never come up.
It never played again. It would never play again. That's actually a very good point.
Which, I mean, is a tragic instance of the remake actually getting rid of a previous version, whereas mostly they were shelved rather than lost.
Well, there would always be a negative in the... I mean, suppose that's what happened when Mark the Vampire came out with London After Midnight. But then, of course, what happened was supposedly London After Midnight got destroyed in a fire at the warehouse, the vault. So even that version no longer exists, and that's the problem. And of course, I mean, The Cat Creeps, which was made in 1930 by Universal, was directed by Rupert Julian, who had done Phantom of the Opera. Yeah. So it's interesting. Do you think Paul Lenny would have done a remake of his own film, which I think he would have? I think they would have given it back to him in 1930 if he was interested.
If he was interested, he might not have been.
Well, it's interesting they did it as a remake rather than just re-release it as they did with Phantom of the Opera in 1930, with new scenes and synchronized sound.
With the Phantom of the Opera, and one, it's a big, expensive film with lots of extras and sets and spectacular stuff. But also it had Lon Chaney's name, and I think probably you could have done a remake. You could. I mean, they did eventually with Claude Rains. They must have had it in development, but I think probably Chaney put such a stamp on the character that they couldn't recast. Whereas with Cat and the Canary, let's say by 1930, all these people were completely out of fashion and gone.
Forgotten, yeah.
And so it's not like, well, we could get, in the way they got Lon Chaney back to do The Unholy Three as a talkie, they didn't feel the need to get Laura LaPlante and Creighton Hale back.
Well, I think both of them were,
later.
their careers were on the wane then. I mean, interestingly, Universal did develop the Phantom of the Opera during the 1930s. I've got a poster for it at home. They actually sent out a poster for that version. And weirdly, it doesn't show the Phantom, it shows the lovers on the poster.
Yeah.
But it never really worked. And obviously, basically somebody else did it in the 40s, and it's a completely different film. But they were at least thinking about doing it.
And I think there was this rash of early talkie films like The Cat Creeps, which were remakes of films or The Unholy Three, which were basically only 2 or 3 years old, but
they brought sound and music,
silent super productions like The Phantom of the Opera, Douglas Fairbanks' Robin Hood, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It took until the end of the 1930s for Hollywood to go back and do them again.
Do another big movie, yeah.
Probably because...
Thief of Baghdad's another great
yes,
one.
That's right.
Another good example.
Yeah.
I think just in this scene, the thing is, I think Cecily looks more insane
yes,
than
right.
Annabelle does. Well, it's like, yes, come with me.
Again, it's part of Willard's, again, really clever plot, is that Cyrus West is right. His relatives are all mad. They're all
extent.
Going mad. And that's why Charlie is actually not just a scheming heir, he is a psychopath.
And he is a and he's very much made of psychopath.
You can also see that all of the other Wests have...
eccentric, I guess, which of course is what Whale brings to the old dark house.
Yeah.
He brings it, you fall into a family of crazy people.
That's
They're
right.
all crazy in the old dark house.
It's also in Arsenic and Old Lace,
Arsenic and Old
is,
Lace.
I think, probably, if you want a last play in this cycle, Arsenic and Old Lace is it. That's the end of...
But again, a huge success in the early 40s on Broadway.
But that's the cycle that begins with Seven Keys to Baldpate, ends with Arsenic and Old Lace. Yeah. And actually, they're both very meta stories. So it's, there's a whole little Scream cycle of ironic melodramas, and here we finally get the cat,
who from the back. That's fabulous, isn't that a fabulous makeup? And that's got to be pretty scary for a 1927 audience. I know nowadays we're looking and you go, okay, but back then, I mean, they really hadn't seen other than Chaney, and maybe Barrymore, I guess, and a few other bits and pieces.
I wonder if the cat is kind of like supposed to be a sort of a conglomeration of all Lon Chaney's parts. It's like, obviously they couldn't get him for a cameo, although that would have been kind of cool.
It would have been, it would have actually been good fun, wouldn't it, to have him in a cameo? He was obviously around at this point still.
But he was, I think, signed with MGM.
MGM and Top Browning, they were doing the Unknown and things.
But again, the cat is an actual menace.
And this is quite, it's like a fist fight, a proper fist fight, rather than action, which a lot of these films didn't have at this point.
Silent cinema is full of blokes wailing on each other, isn't it? It's something that
I don't think they had fire rangers, did they, in those days? It's just like beat the crap out of each other.
They actually look kind of convincing, like bar fights.
That's how people fight. It's like they punch them all over
they're
the
not
body.
choreographed.
Yeah.
It's not like...
You don't throw a punch, you just pummel someone until they fall down.
Yeah.
And again, this is quite a nice action.
We get a chase and some cops, and and this sort of slightly embarrassing couple.
Well, again, you wonder why they didn't have her silent partner in the shorts playing the milkman. So you'd have those two reunited in that. Did he die before this? But this movie before 27.
Yeah.
But that would have been a nice sort of thing for audiences to have gone. And it's almost like they are a double act by this point. They look the same, they behave the same. It's actually just quite a nice little touch, and another nice comedic touch before we get into the horror.
Yes, John Bunny died in 1915.
Oh, so
and I think that ended. That probably she never found. As congenial a comedy partner.
Yeah. Although supposedly they didn't get on very well, from what I read. Which happens in a lot of comedy.
Yeah, that's right.
Comedy teams. And I think it's quite interesting. I think if I remember from the novelization, there's only one policeman on a motorcycle, whereas here there's three. But again, the opening book, sliding bookcase, and the mysterious figure. This is terrific stuff.
And this sequence is more or less what was the first act curtain. Was the heroine unaware that the monster's behind her?
And that in the 39 version, that does happen early in the film, doesn't it? Yeah.
And actually, Bradley Metzger stages a really clever double twist on that, where you think the monster's going to be in the hallway, but actually he's under the dust sheet on one of the armchairs. But here we have more clutching. And that basement, it's kind of like Dracula's basement, isn't it?
You know what? I suspect it's the tunnels under the Paris Opera House, and it's the crypt under Dracula's castle.
And here we see that 1920s convention of the camera going slightly out of focus when the monster's face is lurking.
Well, I think it might just be a technical thing, but I think more importantly, it's basically to soften the horror for the audience, because they really don't want to scare their audience.
I'm not sure. I actually think it increases the horror. I think that
might be a side effect.
You get it at the in the Phantom of the Opera as well, where you get a sense that, because it's a viewpoint shot from the heroine of the monster, that she can't bear to look or to focus on this, and also putting the makeup a bit out of focus actually does make it
a bit more
disturbing.
Realistic.
I think that the few, as it were, hero shots you get of the makeup are quite disturbing here. It's in the long shots where it's a mask on presumably a stuntman rather than Forrest Stanley.
But it is interesting that he did go to all that trouble to put all that fur on his hand and put the extra nails in, unless it's a glove. It's never quite revealed what he's wearing in that respect. But and even walking with the limp and the hunchback is all a bit over egging the pudding. I think.
Yeah, but he's mad.
But he's mad, of course. He's basically taking on the character of the cat.
Yeah, and I also love that the dropped eyeball,
the glass eyes. It's actually
which
described
is
as a
actually
glass eye.
The reveal that this is somebody dressed up rather than a mad killer.
Yeah. And of course, now the audience starts to suspect the guard as well.
And this is a convention. It's in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, isn't it? Where you appeal to the apparent authority figure who's actually in on it.
In on the whole thing.
And
that pulls the rug away under the audience as well.
And so
they think, the policeman or whatever, it's all going to be fine. It's all going to be good. And it's not.
And I think that... Again, this is, I suspect, something that has been done in order to goose an ending of a play, which is just a bunch of people scuffling on stage. That's why we've got the police rushing to the rescue, parallel action, several people in fights.
And you can say people running out of doorways.
So this is a film which ends with action rather than talk.
And also they keep you guessing. I mean, there's still an attempt at this point.
Yeah, that's right. It's only now we get the reveal. Yeah.
But he puts his arm up and uses the cloak to shield his face. And I think it's kind of interesting. And you're still not quite sure. It's like,
wait, have we seen Arthur Edmund Carew for a couple of reels?
Exactly. We haven't, because he went off to get the police.
Yeah.
And this is the reveal. And unlike the monster, the bad makeup, the burn makeup, whatever. He's revealed to be psychologically a monster.
Yeah, and Arthur Edmund Carew is here.
He's back. He's come back from the police. But the blank eye. I mean, this is quite an interesting scene because it's underplayed.
Yeah, Douglas Montgomery does something similar in the 1939 film.
I think he's even more of a red herring, to be honest, in that film.
But the craziness here is kind of
the way it comes over him, like his eyes glaze over, and then suddenly the madness goes into his eyes. Again, for a silent film of this period, it's a remarkable scene,
and it's sort of cruel in interesting ways. I like the shots of particularly the housekeeper and the cousin sort of trying to readjust their opinions of good old Charlie while he's going full on.
Crazy as a bat.
Maniac.
Or crazy as a cat in this one, But I mean, it's a clever wrap up for the movie. I think, and again, he hasn't got his glasses anymore. He's the hero now.
Yeah.
He's taken off his glasses. He probably can't see anything.
Yeah,
can't even see
got scratches.
But he's now the heroic type. And again, is she his mother?
Yeah.
I mean, there's all this kind of subtext
and
going
actually,
on here.
because in this version, the housekeeper seems upset that Charlie's the killer. In the Bob Hope version, Gail Sondergaard kills him, and sort of gloats about it. Yeah.
But now we get the explanation for the audience, which is good. I mean, but it all makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, there are a couple of loose threads hanging, but otherwise, I think
and some of the things that you think of as too broad or too melodramatic, you realise aren't, because it's people lying to you, people pretending to be who they're not.
Yeah, it's a fake narrator basically on this. It's quite interesting. Well, I do find they're all cousins.
Yeah.
I'm a little discomforted by this. They're all cousins. They're all part of the same family, and they've already got a streak of madness running through it already.
Yeah.
Is this really a good idea?
In Arsenic and Old Lace, the big reveal at the end is that Mortimer, the Cary Grant character, has been adopted. He's not a member of the family. And in fact, on the play, he's got this great happy line, "I'm a bastard," which is changed to "I'm the son of a sea cook" in the film.
But overall, I think this film stands up incredibly well.
Yeah.
I mean, for a film made in 1927, not far off 100 years when we're recording this commentary, it keeps you watching every time you see it.
For me, it still feels alive as a film.
Yeah.
It's not just of academic interest, silent movie fans. It's still uproariously entertaining.
Well,
as well.
I would hope a lot of people watching this film now are of a younger age who are seeing it for the first time and actually discovering, they could make films like this back in the 1920s. It is entertaining.
And that's the happy ending. They're still going to have to live in this creepy old house.
But a good cast is worth repeating on a Universal
absolutely.
movie. And they explain it on this one.
Yes,
this is
that's
repeated
right.
at the request of picture patrons.
Yeah.
Which I thought is interesting.
Bad luck if you're a Joe Murphy fan, because he's not going to get credited.
Anyway, thank you for listening to our commentary. We hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've added something to your enjoyment of this film today.
I think there's one more Carl Laemmle name check to
another
come.
Yeah.
I don't think we're getting out of this film without Uncle Carl. Yeah, getting another. Yes,
there we go.
It's a Universal picture. And write me your opinion. It's a bit late if you want to do that. But
he answered every letter.
That's right. Yeah.
And excellent. I think the score is excellent on this for a British Rare score. And the fact it's it's based on the original music sheets, I think it's fantastic. Well done, the Museum of Modern Art.
Absolutely.